Well, my name is Scott Young. I have a blog. I've been writing for about 15 years. I think the thing people maybe know me best for is doing these learning challenges. So I did one about 10 years ago now, I'm dating myself, where it was trying to learn MIT's four-year computer science curriculum. So they post a lot of their material online for free. And I just had this idea after I graduated from my university with a business degree. I thought, well, I'd like to study computer science, and they have all these materials, including final exams with solutions. And I was like, has anyone ever tried to do this before? So that was the first big project I did. And it got me a little bit of attention / notoriety maybe. And then the second project I did with a friend. We went to 4 countries to learn 4 different languages. We went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea. And the kind of crux of that project was that when we'd land in the countries, we'd try to the greatest extent possible not to speak in English to each other or to anyone we'd meet. So, if we met people on the street, we were in Spain, we'd speak in Spanish. We'd speak in Spanish to each other at home. And we did a little little mini video documentaries of that so people can kind of see our progress there. And it worked pretty well. I mean, after the 3 months in each country, we were able to make friends and have conversations and this kind of thing. So I think that was also for me another example of for most people, I think the idea that you could, spend a year learning 4 different languages seems like that isn't something you could do. But I've now actually met a number of people who have done similar projects. So it's definitely not even just a case that, I'm super smart or something. I know people who have actually done this. So that was another project. And then I've done a bunch of other smaller projects. I did one learning quantum mechanics. I did one learning portrait drawing in the middle of the pandemic. My wife is from North Macedonia, and we did a little project that was a little over a month, and we just spoke Macedonian to each other at home. So it was a much similar to the travel project, but limited in scope. And also to try to showcase that the thing that mattered about the project was the having someone to speak with and only speaking the language, not physically being in the country, which I think sometimes people get the idea that being in the country is the really important part, whereas it's really the following the no English rule, which is the important part. And so, I've done a number of those projects that kind of culminated in a book I published in 2019, Ultra Learning, which was talking not only about some of my projects, but a lot of the people who inspired me, who are kind of, not always super well known, other internet weirdos who are doing these kinds of learning projects, and also famous people from history who, maybe had underappreciated sort of efforts to teach themselves things in the past. So I kind of wanted to put them all together and then pair it up with what we know from cognitive science about how people learn things, so that even if you're not going to do weird internet projects, even if you're just doing learning on your own and you just want to improve things, what does science say about the best way to do that?
Amazing. So, I mean, particularly today, which part of your journey that I wanted to focus, one was definitely your traveling spree.
Okay.
And the second thing was learning through distraction. I feel 2013 is when you sort of travel all these 4 countries, if I'm not wrong.
2013, 2014, I think. Yeah.
Super awesome.
You know better than I do. I'm so bad with dates.
Not at all. So I think today's generation, or the young ones today, if you were 18 today, you probably have a smartphone plugged in with earphones, and you're distracted all throughout the day with all the notifications that come, right? If someone is supposed to do this today, what are the challenges that you feel they would be facing, and how could they sort of cope up with them?
Yeah, well, I've always felt that technology is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, everything you're talking about is true. It's clearly not the case that with the world's knowledge at our fingertips, we've all become these kind of scholars. No, we mostly just, browse TikTok and Reddit and stupid cat videos and stuff. This is what we do. And I think I'm not even saying that to be crotchety and judgmental. I think it's just human nature to be drawn to things that have this kind of novelty and information value. That's very deep in our hardwiring. So I don't think it's something that if you aren't really intentional about this is how I want to spend my limited mental bandwidth, my limited time on this planet, if you don't make that decision, then that is the default, is that you're going to get sort of sucked into this. And so I do think that there is a disadvantage there, but I also think it goes the other way too, that it's not wrong. We do actually have the world's knowledge at our fingertips. If you wanted to learn just about anything, there's a plethora of resources right now to be able to do it. So, even take the example of learning Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah.
I follow this blog, Language Log, and it has this great linguist, Victor Marr. I think his name is Mayer, maybe. And he is a sinologist. He's very erudite scholar of Chinese language. And he talks a lot about how difficult it was for him to learn to read Chinese. But then you hear him describe his process, and it's like, well, that was back in the day when you had paper dictionaries. So you read a sentence and you don't know a word, and then you have to look up the word in the dictionary, which is really difficult. You have to figure out what the radical is, and you're browsing through and you're finding in this kind of thing. And so it's just really, really effortful to do. Now, you have your phone like this, and there's little apps that you can just like tap on the text and it'll tell you what the characters mean. And there's flashcards for doing this. And there's like even things that will correct your handwriting, stroke order and stuff without a teacher. So, I mean, I think the point I want to make is that we live in a world where, yes, there's lots of distractions, there's lots of difficulties, but there's also lots of opportunities. And so I think it's important to focus on those opportunities and focus on, all the ways that we can improve ourselves that are really quite recent. Even my MIT challenge idea, it would not have been possible had I tried to do it like 5 years before I tried to do it, or 10 years, it would have been actually impossible. MIT courseware, I think, was about 10 years old when I had it, but even 5 years, there wouldn't have been enough material to do it. And so we're really looking at this small window. Now, I mean, there's always been textbooks. You can always go to a library. So I don't want to say that it's been literally impossible to teach yourself things, but I think the fact that we now have access to so much material means that, for someone who is dedicated, someone who really wants to learn these things, it is actually possible to do it in a way that it might have been, 4 or 5 times as much effort a generation ago.
Got it. Super. Just a follow-up thought on that. I really like the way you said that the opportunity out there is like humongous. It just depends on which one you're sort of chasing, right? Now, all of us have 24 hours. You spend it in a different way. I spend it in a different way. There's no ideal way. But in India specifically, as much as I've been in the education sector, there are these so-called gurus who say, this is the time you wake up. This is what you do at this point in time, right? I want to know from your experience, because you've been following ultra learning and you've been teaching about that. Is there an ideal way of spending these 24 hours? If not, what is it? I mean,
let me preface this. So I think habits are really important. I mean, James Clear wrote the foreword to my book, and his sort of phenomenal bestseller, Atomic Habits, is sort of built around this idea that habits are very important. And so I think habits are very important. However, that gets kind of distorted sometimes into the idea that what matters is the routine that you have, which I don't think it's that important. So the idea that like, oh, well, so-and-so was successful because they woke up at 5 a.m. every day. I'm like, well, okay, yeah, if those few hours in the morning, they were more productive, maybe that's what worked for them. But I mean, there's also people who that's not what they did at all, and they were successful. So I think the idea of like the link between routines and how much success you experience in life is really underdetermined. And I think it also misses, like, people imbue these things with a certain, almost like a mystical property that like, if you just wake up early enough, all the other things that are difficult about being successful at things or achieving things or whatever is going to go away. I don't think that's the case. I mean, again, waking up early, probably helpful if the rest of the day is busy and but it's very strategic. It's very much just something that you do to like accomplish a specific purpose. And so similarly, I think there's a lot of other things where people, they get into these ritualistic kind of ideas. And again, there's nothing wrong with rituals. I don't mistake me, but I think you don't want to imbue them in this significance that like the key to being successful is to just have all these sort of near superstitious rituals about like, okay, well, I meditate for 15 minutes and then I do this journaling for 15 minutes. And then I, sit here and do 3 Pomodoros and then like, this is how I'm going to be successful. And it's like, well, if that works for you, great. But I mean, what's going to determine whether you're successful is like, what is the content of the work you're doing, right? Is that effective? Like, who cares whether you do 15 minutes of meditation? I mean, if it makes you calm, if it makes you happy, great. But don't go too far, because I think sometimes there can be this idea that like, if you just get the right routine, I think, it's just one piece of the puzzle. But as I said, habits are very important. And I think the way they're very important is that we misjudge how effortful things are going to be in the long term, because as you do something over and over again, it reduces the effort cost. So some of that's related to learning, and some of that's related to just habituation. And so I do think that there is a little bit of a cognitive illusion that when you imagine doing something in the beginning, it's really effortful, it's really difficult, but then you do it over a long period of time and it stops being effortful. And so this causes us to misjudge our investments or the projects we undertake. I mean, even take the Year Without English project that I did with that, when I talk to people about that, they just have this idea that it's just going to be like the most grueling year-long grind. But the thing that's really hard to impress upon people is that after just, let's say 3 weeks, like Spanish, especially, Mandarin and Korean took a little longer, but let's say 3 weeks for Spanish, it was not difficult doing it. Now, that doesn't mean we were good after 3 weeks. I think that's also another mistake. Correct. Is that, well, we were fluent in 3 weeks. No, it's just that the idea of living your entire life in Spanish after 3 weeks, when you're doing it that often, it's like, fish in water. You just don't notice it that much. I mean, you're probably making mistakes. There's probably lots of things you can't express, but you've kind of gotten into this comfort zone. And so I think that's something that is underappreciated, because if you were trying to imagine that, and you let's say you even just accepted on face value that you think that method would work, and you're like, well, I don't have the energy to do that for 3 months, right? So I think this is where the habits play an important role. But I think, again, it's not like when we were on that trip, the fact that I woke up at 7 a.m. and then, I did 20 minutes of meditation and I did 30 minutes of journaling. That wasn't those weren't the key ingredients that made that work. It was the speaking Spanish all the time. So, I mean, I think that's the part that you have to really impress upon people. I think sometimes there can be this sort of magical thinking, as opposed to how much of the work are you doing? Are you getting the work done? Is it the right work to be working on? Other than that, I mean, those are the main questions. Everything else is just a facility.
No, absolutely. I think what people forget is everything that they do is a means to an end. They forget the end and they just sort of focus on, 15 minutes of journaling, X, Y, Z. They don't know why they're doing it. Even if they know, they probably don't evaluate that, right?
Well, I mean, again, don't get me wrong. Starting out habits, trying out habits, experimenting with behaviors, it can be good. I just think the thing that I sort of worry about is this kind of maximalist philosophy where that on its own is sort of enough. And I think that the risk there is that you're focusing on something, again, that's very underdetermined. How do you succeed at something very specific and difficult? Well, it's from doing very specific and difficult things, specific and difficult things. It's not, the habits might be good scaffolding to get you there, but just understand that's what they're doing, is that they're scaffolding. They're not replacing the work, or they're not, there's nothing magical about it. I guess that my point is just I'm just sick of reading articles about Warren Buffett's breakfast routine or something like that. Who cares what Warren Buffett?
That's why I asked you the question.
He's not. It's not because he has a Diet Coke or whatever. He has a Coke for lunch every day. That's one of these little Warren Buffett tidbits people trot out. But it's who cares? Who cares? He's clearly a successful investor because he knows a lot about investing.
Correct.
And he's really skilled at it in a way that is difficult to replicate. So I mean, this again. Yeah, having good routines probably helpful, but I mean, let's not crystal ball it and try to say okay, well, what is the specific Warren Buffett routine that's going to make me equally successful? I mean, it's just, I don't know, it can get to an absurd degree if you take it too far.
That is true. No, absolutely. I think you've hit the right point by giving the example itself. Now, leaving aside the habits part, right? Let's go back 15 years back. You started writing.
Yeah.
What was the mindset that you had? One, because it was, I remember you saying that in the blogging world, you're a dinosaur. Yeah. What was your mindset like? Setting that to self-direction is super hard. What was your take on?
Right. So, I don't know. I think I got into this in sort of a weird way too. I think the correct story, the story I'm supposed to tell, is sort of I just started writing because it was my passion, and then just who knows, I became successful at it. That's the story that I think people you kind of people often like practice these sort of like they were successful by accident sort of narratives. I think it just makes them seem more human and relatable. But I don't think that was what it was at all for me. Like from the get-go, the thing that I was interested in was running an online business. And I really liked this idea of being my own boss and stuff. So that was very much in the background from the beginning. I mean, is blogging a good strategy to do that? Probably not. I think that was maybe also just my own like naivete and stuff. But in 2006, I mean, there were people who were starting to do that. And I was thinking, well, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do business wise, but I thought, you know what, I'll do some writing and that'll kind of create a website and a platform, and then I can kind of figure things out. And so it sort of started from there. And then I think where it started to take off was when I wrote Learn More, Study Less, which was a couple years in. And then I actually was getting some sales from that. And it was sort of like, okay, people like this learning advice angle. I was a student. It was probably the only thing I was qualified to give any advice on. Even then, that's questionable. And so I was, that's sort of how I got started into it. But I think like when I actually started, it was, I wanted to do something that might lead to a career. And so I think that is unusual and it's sort of weird and ambitious to say it that way. So I mean, I think people don't like people who are sort of like, oh yeah, I'm going to make lots of money from this or this kind of thing. But I think when I started out, my idea was very much like, I'd like to do this. I'd like to do not necessarily blogging, but I'd like to do something online creative for a living. And so I think I was a little bit ahead of the curve there on that, because that was a very new, weird sort of fake thing when I was doing it. Whereas now I think the idea that like people are influencers or YouTubers or streamers or whatever version of ERS you want to talk about, that's a thing now. That, it's very difficult. I don't want I think I was naive in a sense that, I don't think I've fully appreciated just how stringent the kind of like work I would have to do to get to that point. But I think that, I think that was very much my goal in the beginning. And I think that also was part of the reason that I worked really hard at it, because I was thinking, oh, well, I might want to do something like this for a living, as opposed to just, this is just for fun. And then like, oops, I guess I'm successful at it. I don't know. People like to talk about these narratives all the time, which are like this, which I also think is, it's done to make the person seem relatable, but I think it makes the path to becoming good at things where very few people succeed even more opaque, because it makes it look like people are like the people who succeed are not even trying, when I know these people personally, like they are very much trying. They put in enormous amounts of effort into these pursuits.
Correct. Now, I mean, so you come from the Western side of the world, which is in India, like idealism, it's an ideal sort of way of living life. And I personally know, because I've traveled quite a bit now, I think 3 continents, and I have seen people going through the same sort of struggles that every human being across the world goes through, right? So while you were living your life, and there's a lot more to come, there are these negative thoughts that come to your mind, right? The struggle part that comes before success. How do you tackle it? How would you suggest someone who's listening this tackling it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the wrong thing to say to someone who's struggling with it is the kind of like, well, everything's going to be okay advice. First of all, because it's not true. Lots of people fail at things, especially when the thing is really difficult. Like if you're trying to launch a company, or you're trying to become like an actor, or musician, or an academic, or any kind of profession like that has a non-zero failure rate. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that it's that the uncertainty about whether or not you'll make it is very much embedded in the pursuit, and that's something you have to get comfortable with. I think that you might be putting in a lot of energy in something that turns out to be a dead end, or you're just sort of like, okay, that didn't go anywhere. But I think the way I always sort of rationalize it to myself is that, well, you're always sort of in a situation in life where you're kind of just you're going to spend your time and energy somehow. And so the question is just sort of like, is this an investment that I want to make, even if it may work or may not work? And so that was always my attitude starting with this, is I always kind of felt like, well, this may not work out. I might just putting in a lot of effort and it doesn't go anywhere. But, like sort of looking back, would I rather have been doing something else, right? Is there something else I would rather be doing? And for me, the answer was no. Like, this is what I wanted to do. It was worth it to me. Okay, let's do it. And then I think once you're in it, then you just have to work as hard as you can, and with the constraint of like not burning yourself out and this kind of thing. But you want to be putting in effort and that kind of thing. So I think that's, I guess, I don't know, I'm being really vague here, but I feel like the idea is that you want to get comfortable with that uncertainty as opposed to trying to dismiss it. I think sometimes the advice is like, you need to kind of banish the uncertainty, and it's like unshakable faith in yourself. And I think that's cognitively unstable, because it's not true. So you can kind of like delude yourself for a little bit, and then you get a setback, and then it crumbles it's just sort of more like, no, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing something that's hard, and I might fail at it, and that's why I need to work hard. But I've sort of accepted that despite the uncertainty, this is what I want to be doing, and this is where I want to invest my time. And so I think that's an important. And I mean, if that's not true, if when you're actually making that rational analysis and you're sort of saying to yourself, well, actually, no, if I'm not guaranteed to succeed at this, it's not worth it for me, then don't do it. You know what I mean? Like like, I think that's another mistake, is this kind of idea that like people should be doing risky professional paths when, given the fact that it's uncertain, they're not willing to invest in it. Is like, no, go get the stable job, go do something that's like going to be a sure thing. Because if you don't like that, if you don't like the fact that there's going to be some risk, then choose something that's less risky. So I think that's very much embedded in the pursuit. But I think there's also something freeing about that, because I think if you kind of go into it with eyes open, like, this is what I'm doing. I know what the stakes are. I know that there's uncertainty and risk, and I'm not going to be able to guarantee that it's going to be successful. But obviously my chances of success go up the more work I put in. I think if you can get comfortable with that deal that you're making with yourself, it's a different kind of feeling. I think sometimes people sort of cede their autonomy that like, oh, well, so-and-so said it would work out, right? And they're trying to remove that responsibility of that decision and put it onto someone else, whether that's their parents or whether that's some person they listen to online, me, I don't know, anyone else that they want to like project like, well, so-and-so said this would work, or this is what you're supposed to do. And I think just a failure to kind of accept and take responsibility for the uncertainty of life, I think it can create problems, because then you're not the one sort of taking control and making decisions. And so I think that's important. But I do think that, you have to just kind of get comfortable with that uncertainty.
Yeah, I think people are not very comfortable with uncertainty when they're definitely in their young ages. And I think that brings me to another thought. When I don't know what the objective is, how do I kickstart learning? What's the starting point?
Well, you got to figure out what the objective is, right? I mean, like, I think the thing is that, learning is good. And so I think there can be a risk of like the kind of analysis paralysis where you spend so much time sort of fretting about, am I making the exact right investment, that you don't invest in anything at all. But then there's the opposite scale where there's the person trying to do too many things because they haven't kind of focused down a priority and committed to it. So it's about finding that sweet spot. But I think the idea is that learning works best when you have kind of specific concrete goals that you're working towards. So those can be to make something, like I want to be able to like make a website or make an app for Android or whatever. It can be a goal to sort of just learn something for a set period of time. So that was kind of like the Year Without English. It was like, okay, we're going to be in Spain for 3 months. Let's try to learn as much Spanish as we can. So it wasn't really constrained in terms of a particular accomplishment. You can be trying to learn for an exam. You can be trying to learn a particular book, a particular class, So I think it's just, you need to constrain the scope so that there's something specific that you're working on and it's clear when you're working on it, when you're not working on it, what counts as working on it, what the scope is. Because I think, wrangling projects down to that format where it's like, okay, I can actually make progress on this. I can actually just sort of plug away at it for a month or two is super important. And I think it's more important, the harder the thing is. So people often talk to me about like, well, what about, just this sort of just following your interests or curiosity for learning. I'm like, well, that's great. But the thing is that when you hit some impasse where to get further progress requires you to learn something that's hard and unpleasant, well, then the curiosity goes down a different path, right? So, I mean, if you accept the idea that, well, a lot of the skills worth learning are going to have those impasses, then there's no other way, right? Like you need to have this sort of concrete, goal-directed sort of a learning approach. And again, this sort of ties into this whole broader theme of like, yeah, you could just learn a lot of things just being on Twitter all the time, right? You just follow interesting people and just read what they're saying. But as soon as it's sort of like, well, in order to understand the argument they're making, I have to first understand, like I have to first have like university level statistics knowledge. Well, like forget it. Like you know, that detour is not going to happen just for most people. Just like, okay, well, let's pop open a statistics class and then spend, 50 hours mastering it. And then I'll come back to that tweet and then I'll understand it. Like you're not going to do that, right?
Doesn't make sense.
So the only way that works is if you're like, okay, you know what? I really need to improve my statistics knowledge. You buy a book, you enroll in a course, and then you learn it. Like that's the only way I've found that you can actually do that. So I think that's an important distinction to maintain. I think people sometimes would like it to be just all of the first kind, but I think there is unavoidable kind of little difficult steps involved in learning things. So I think that's why it's important.
Absolutely. I think, I can relate this to myself so much. So I started this podcast, the ideation of it is in 2019, August of 2019, right? And I kickstarted interviewing folks only a month and a half back. I touched like 15 episodes and I'm like, 2 years back, I did not know what the objective was, but today I do. Because via this conversation, so this 45 minutes, I'm going to listen to it twice while one, editing the video, second, while also editing the audio. I'm going to learn so much, not in terms of, oh, I learned from Scott and I want to be successful like him, but hey, I learned from Scott and these are the things that I can implement in my life, right? In case that makes sense to me, right? Right. And this journey started, Scott, to be very frank with you, to be very productive personally, right? And I think you speak about that a lot in your talks. Where does one start? Is it tools? Is it mapping out everything point by point? This is what I'm going to do from Monday to Friday. Weekends is for this. How does one start that? And then we can sort of deep dive into it before we close it off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that you're right about though, is that where does that energy come from to be productive? And it usually comes from the idea that, well, I'm working on something hard that if I'm not productive, I won't be successful at it. And so, this kind of goes back to this doubt, uncertainty, working on ambitious things. I think that if you don't have that, then productivity, like a lot of the stuff, like what, especially what you're talking about, like, okay, I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. and I'm going to do this for 4 hours and then I'm going to go to my job. And then like, that's hard to do, right? Like it is much easier to sleep in. So you have to have some reason why you're doing it. And so I don't think anyone can give you that reason. I think you have to find it for yourself. But I think it's important to ground it in this context of like, if you don't have that, then a lot of this advice just seems like an unnecessary like hardship. And then I think where do you start? Well, I don't know. I feel like it depends on the person. I really like Capture Systems is a good place to start. Like Getting Things Done is a good book to start reading. I think just because getting organized is often a precursor to actually making forward progress on the goals. Like if it's just all in your head, it's very difficult to stay focused. So that's a really useful thing, is that you've got a calendar, you've got a to-do list, you've actually got some systems. So getting the to-do list items onto your agenda for the day. And then you're like, okay, this is what I'm working on right now.
Correct.
I think those are important. I think having again, the scaffolding, the routines, the habits, they are very important for getting it kickstarted, right? They're not going to be
correct.
They're going to be very generic. They're not going to be the thing that leads to a specific accomplishment. But obviously, if you have limited time in the day and you're waking up early and you're getting 2 hours of like unbroken concentration every day, if you can do that steadily, then that definitely adds up. So I think that's also another thing that makes a big difference. And I think those are good places to start. So I think starting with habits is often very helpful for people because it's also entirely under your control. So a lot of what I think the difficulty can be pursuing ambitions and goals is there can be a bit of a confidence trap that like, you haven't done, or you haven't succeeded in a lot of things before. And so there's a little bit of an uncertainty and anxiety about like, oh, okay, well, is this actually going to work out?
Yeah.
Whereas, can I just wake up at, 6 a.m. every day is something that like, that's 100% in your control. You can do that, right? Whereas,
Correct.
Can I make $1 million in 5 years or something is like, maybe, but
Maybe.
I mean, that's not something that you can guarantee is going to happen unless there's like a person who's going to cut you $1 million check at the end of some process. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, and sometimes you're going to be lucky and unlucky, and there's going to be trial and error. Whereas, can I wake up at 6 a.m. every day is something that you can actually do. So I think often starting with those goals that are entirely under your control. So like getting a gym habit, getting set up with a productivity system. Maybe it's getting things done. Maybe it's, Cal Newport has a good one. Time block, I think it's time block scheduling. I'm forgetting what he's calling it now. And, I had one called Weekly Daily Goals, which is a sort of super simple system that I used a lot when I was in university. And so getting started with a system like that, getting started with exercising, getting started with, waking up a bit earlier. These are all good, like, I call them like hygiene habits. They're not going to get like the result on its own, but they just create a kind of a, clean productivity environment where you actually like, it's easier to get things done. And I think they also are very important because if you've successfully installed habits, if you've successfully set up these things, it does give you some more confidence. Like, okay, actually, if I set a goal and I work at it, I can achieve it. I mean, that sounds really basic, but it's not a belief that you think about rationally. It's something you feel, right? So people who are successful in life, I think often kind of maybe look down on a little bit of self-help ideas because it's obvious to them, right?
Yeah.
Obviously setting a goal and working at it, you can achieve it because, successful people do that all the time.
Correct.
But if you've not had a lot of that personal experience, it is a bit of a question mark to you. And so, sometimes I will have readers who will email me things where like, that's clearly the problem, is that they don't have this confidence in themselves yet, that they're able to do things. And so it can be one of those barriers. And so I think starting with habits is often very useful because it is 100% under your control. So there's not going to be these other messy external factors. Whereas like, I want to start a successful business. You can work, like going back to this uncertainty idea, you can work as hard as you can and you pull out all the stops and still fail at it. I mean, that's life. Like sometimes that happens. And so I think those are less helpful for building that confidence, just because, you work really, really hard and then you fail at the goal through no fault of your own. And then your brain learns this kind of reward signal of like, well, it's pointless. Why bother trying? Right. So I do think starting with those good habits can be helpful, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it. But I mean, it is just one step in the process. It's not going to be the end point either. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, I've taken up so many points from the hygiene habits part. Definitely, I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, just to sort of wrap it up, I think one thing that I want to know from you is, do you use any tools that support your hygiene habits? Is it something that you follow regularly? Some tool that
I'm
you use?
I'm bad with tools. Yeah, I don't use a lot of tools. My to-do list is with Max reminders, and I use the calendar app for scheduling. These days, my situation is a little different. So I want to stress this as well. When I got started, I think a lot of my life was dealing with the kind of, I would call it like to-do list task checking type productivity. So I would start off and it would be like, okay, I've got to read this assignment for university and I've got to do this thing to, freelance writing assignment to make a little bit of money. And then I'm doing this thing for my blog. And none of the tasks are that hard, but it's like being productive is just like getting them done consistently and, not wasting time and that kind of thing. Whereas now I'm in a bit of a different situation because like I have a business, I have a team that is like 11 other people or something like this. And so like a lot of those kind of tasks, I don't do them anymore. And so what are the tasks that are left for me? It's like, okay, like, write an amazing book that's going to be a bestseller. Like, that's just like a different kind of task where it's like, okay, all right. Like, I just got to like work on it for like weeks where I'm just like thinking and like doing research. And so it's a bit of a different process for me right now. And so I feel like I rely on these tools a little less, in part because I have a little bit less clutter for some of these other activities. I don't want to say that I still have the to-do list in the calendar, but I mean,
Correct.
a lot of my day is like, well, I've got a podcast today, and then the rest of today is just me doing work on a new book, which that's just going to be for like, I don't know, 6 hours. Like that's all I'm doing. Right. So it's a little bit of a different kind of activity versus like, okay, I've got 15 things I have to do today. How can I make sure I get all those 15 things done? And each of the things is not that hard, but like, maybe it's a little unpleasant. Maybe I procrastinate and stuff. So I think I'm in a bit of a different productivity situation. I think when people are starting out, they tend to be in that first situation where you have lots of tasks and stuff. It's, I think, only when you get to a position where you're able to delegate a lot of things that that you don't have those problems to deal with. But I mean, it does create a different situation. I know like our team uses Asana. I don't use it that much, again, because I don't have that many tasks on it. But like that's the tool that we use for coordinating our team, and it works pretty well for productivity. So I guess I'd recommend that one. But yeah, for me, it's mostly reminders and just calendar.
Perfect. I think you reminded me of two things that I want to ask you now. You joined in on the call 4 minutes early. Yeah. Why? And again, why? You could have joined in sharp on time.
I mean, I could. It was 9 a.m. was our call. So I hadn't, I just finished up getting everything ready at home. I just came here. I think I came here maybe like 20 to 9. I just did some emails, and it was a few minutes before I have to get this microphone thing set up for the call. So I got it all plugged in, and then it's like, all right, I'll just put it on in the background. And then I just finished my email until you called me. So that sort of was how I did it.
Super nice. Now, the point I wanted to, the point I want to highlight is I've worked with a lot of young folks, and being on time and being disciplined is a huge hassle, right? And you joining 4 minutes early for a random Indian doing a podcast on you was something that I was like, okay, fine, I have to get going, right? Just a final thing on that, Scott, right? You give a lot of advice, but wherever you are today, you would have probably heard a lot of people, learned from a lot of people. What is that one piece of advice that you probably would take to your grave that has probably changed the track of your life?
I'm always bad at these kind of like, what's the one thing, because there's so many things, right? Like I think it's just this accumulation of little ideas.
You can put them all together.
But I think a big thing that did definitely help me early on was this idea that you need to face your doubts and uncertainties and fears you have in life. I tend to be a little bit more, let's say, somewhat rationalistic in the advice I give, where I'm like, it's very kind of like a little cold-blooded and like thinking models and this kind of thing. But that's not how it feels. I mean, when you're facing problems in your life, there's a lot of emotional feeling associated with them. And I think there is a lot of doubt, and like what we were talking about, how do you cope with doubt when you're dealing with some challenge or some difficulty in your life, I think is a big problem. And so I think an idea that I've really kind of taken with me is that facing those things is part of life, and that's like what you should be doing. And I think that it's a sort of I don't have a justification for it. It's a very like foundational sort of belief, but I think it runs a bit contrary to the idea that like protecting yourself from those kinds of things is the goal of life, like protecting yourself from uncertainty or situations that make you uncomfortable, or things that you're afraid of, especially if they're not like actually going to kill you, dangerous kind of situations. Like the person who's like they should be trying to get a job, but they don't send their resume out because they're worried about getting rejected, right?
Correct.
I think it's not to say that I can remove that fear, but just the idea that like facing that fear is part of what life is for, I think is a kind of foundational belief that makes you think that uncomfortable feeling you have is something good, as opposed to this idea that like anytime I feel kind of uncertainty or afraid or this kind of thing, it's because I've done something wrong. And so I think that's a sort of very higher order belief. And I think that it creates a lot of downstream things. And so I definitely feel like, from talking to some people, they've internalized the other belief that whenever I feel uncomfortable, stressed, overwhelmed, doubt, uncertainty, it's because I've done something wrong and I need to fix that. It creates a very totally different cascade of behavior. And I mean, again, I don't have any justification for it. I'm not saying that the belief is true. I'm just saying that I think it's something that if you believe one or the other, you lead a totally different pattern for your life.
No, absolutely. I think I did a fair bit of research, and it was super nice to have you on this podcast, Scott. Thanks a lot for taking your time. How can people reach out to you if they want to hit you up?
Yeah, you can go to my website, scotthyoung.com. My book, Ultra Learning, is available Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I think if you have readers in India, it will probably be a yellow cover for the book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess.
There's a green cover, the American. There's a yellow cover for the UK/international edition. They're the same content, just have different covers. It's just a constant thing where people are like, I can't find your book, or this is a fake version of the book or something. No, it's just a different cover. I don't know why they do that, but publishing. So you can get the book there. And of course, there's lots of free articles on my website. So don't need to buy any of my stuff. You can go there and just read things if you're interested in some of these ideas.